In this module, I will be reviewing Lecture 1 and Lecture 2. In Lecture 1, we talked about Introduction to Listening and Speaking plus Listening as Comprehension. In the introduction part, we discussed that courses in listening and speaking skill have a prominent place in the language programs around the world today. Ever-growing needs for fluency in English around the world because of the role of English as the world's international language have given priority to finding more effective ways to teach English. It is therefore timely to review what our current assumptions and practices are concerning the teaching of these crucial language skills. Our understanding of the nature of listening and speaking has undergone considerable changes in the recent years. And in this course, I want to explore some of those changes and their implications for classroom teaching and material design. The first module was about the teaching of listening. And in it, we had a two perspective on: one, listening as comprehension; second, listening as acquisition. Listening as comprehension is the traditional way of thinking about the nature of listening. Indeed, in most methodology manuals, listening and listening comprehensions are synonymous. This view of listening is based on the assumption that the main function of the listening in second language learning is to facilitate understanding of a spoken discourse. We will examine this view of listening in some detail before we considering a complementary view of listening as acquisition. This later view of listening considers how listening can provide input that triggers the further development of second language proficiency. The cognitive psychology, the neuroscience, the bottom-up processing. The bottom-up processing refers to using the incoming input as the basis for understanding the message. Comprehension begins with received data that is analyzed as successive levels of organization, sounds, words, clauses, sentences, texts, until meaning is derived. Comprehension is viewed as a process of decoding. Teaching bottom-up processing is somewhat learners need a large vocabulary, a good working knowledge of a sentence structure to process text bottom-up. Exercises that develop bottom-up processing help the learners to do such thing as the following, where they can retain input while it is being processed. Student can recognize word and clauses divisions. Student can recognize key words. Student can recognize key transition in a discourse. They can recognize grammatical relationship between key elements in sentences. They can use stress and intonation to identify words and sentence functions. Now let's talk about top-down processing. Well, top-down processing, on the other hand, refers to the use of a background knowledge in understanding the message of the meaning of the message, whereas bottom-up processing goes from language to meaning. Top-down processing goes from meaning to language. The background knowledge required for top-down processing may be previous knowledge about the topic of discourse, situational or contextual knowledge, or the knowledge in the form of schemata or scripts, plans about overall structure of events and the relationship between them. For example, that we consider how we might respond to the following utterance. I heard on the news there was a big earthquake in China last night. On recognizing the word earthquake, we generate a set of questions for which we want to answer. Where exactly was the earthquake? How big was it? Did it cause a lot of damage? Were many people killed or injured? What rescue efforts are underway? Now let me go to Lecture 2, which was on listening as acquisition. Our discussion in it was so far has to dealt with one perspective on listening, namely listening as comprehension, just we talked about it. Everything we have discussed has been based on the assumption that the role of listening in a language program is to help develop learners' abilities to understand things that they listen to. I'm therefore advising that the context where comprehension and acquisition are the goals of listening courses, I think two-part strategy is appropriate in the classroom teaching and instructional materials. Phase 1, listening as comprehension, which we discussed in the previous lecture. And phase 2, listening as acquisition. The listening texts used are now used as the basis for speaking activity, making use of noticing activities and restructuring activities. And that leads us to the routine of the expression or the functions of language, such as talk as interaction, talk as transaction, talk as performance. Talk as interaction refers to what we normally mean by conversation and describe interaction that serves a primarily social function. When people meet, they exchange greetings, engage in a small talk, recount recent experiences, and so on because they wish to be friendly and to establish a comfortable zone of interaction with others. Talk as transaction refers to situation where the focus is on what is said or done, the message, and making oneself understood clearly and accurately is the central focus, rather than the participant and how they interact socially with each other. Talk as performance was a third type of talk that usefully be distinguished has been called talk as performance. This refers to the public talk, that is, talk that transmits information before an audience, such as classroom presentation, public announcements and speeches, and so on, so forth. And that is how we come to the end of lecture 3.